Today, we're going to add animated textures to our particle system in Unreal and Unity. Let's go! Alright, so this is the 9th video in our series on making a particle system using the Unreal Material Editor or Unity's shader graph. If you haven't seen the other videos yet, I'll link the playlist down in the description so you can catch up. So far, we've added the features to our particle system to allow us to control the movement, rotation, and scale of the particles. But up until now, our particles have just been these square colored polygons. Today, we're going to fix that by adding animated textures. To create the animated effect, we're going to use a technique called Flipbook animation. I'm not going to go too deep into how it works because it's a topic I've already covered on the channel, and I'll link that video down in the description so you can learn it in detail if you want to. But to summarize, we use a texture that looks like this. It's a collection of frames of animation, and the shader sets up the UV coordinates so that we display each of the frames in sequence. So let's go ahead and jump into our shader and add these features. Alright, so here is the shader that we've created so far in this series of videos. You can see that we're doing all of these different steps to create the movement and rotation and scale of our particles. The first thing that we need to do to add our Flipbook animation is to add the Flipbook node. So this node calculates the texture coordinates that we need in order to create our animated effect. In order to save on performance, we're going to do most of the calculation in the Vertex shader, and then we're going to pass that data to the pixel shader to sample the texture right at the end of the process. So really, we're going to be setting this up in two different steps. First, we're going to do the Vertex shader portion, and then we're going to jump over to the pixel shader. So what we're going to do now is move the fragment block down here just a bit, and this is going to give us some room in this portion of the shader here to create our Flipbook coordinates. And once we calculate the Flipbook coordinates, we're going to need to pass them from the Vertex stage to the fragment or pixel shader stage. And so the way that we do that, I'm going to click the Vertex stage here and hit the space bar, and we're going to add a custom interpolator. And this is the way that we pass data from the Vertex stage to the pixel stage. So I'm going to select my custom interpolator, open up my graph inspector, and we're going to name this particle data. We're going to be passing the X and Y, or the U and V coordinates for our Flipbook, and then in future videos we're going to use the Z and W channels to pass some additional data from the Vertex shader to the pixel shader. All right, so next we need to input our parameters for our Flipbook node here. Oh, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and connect up our Flipbook node to our custom interpolator. So we're going to split out the U and V coordinates here and then combine them again. And what this is going to do for us is pass the UV coordinates that we're generating from the Vertex shader to the pixel shader. So we've got our U and our V coordinates coming out of the Flipbook node, and then we're passing those into the red and green channels of our custom interpolator here, our particle data. And like I said, we're going to be using these last two slots for additional data in a future video. All right, next we need a width and a height for our Flipbook node. And this has to do with the number of rows and the number of columns in our texture. So if we take a look at our texture again here, this is the one we're going to be using by default. And it has 8 columns and 4 rows. And so those are the dimensions we're going to give it. So we'll create a parameter here in our blackboard. And this is a vector 2. And we're just going to call this Flipbook dimensions. And we'll open up our inspector for a minute, and we're going to give it the default values of 8 and 4. So we have 8 columns and 4 rows. Then we'll bring in our Flipbook dimensions parameter and add a split node so that we can split out the columns and the rows. And I'm just going to plug those directly into width and height. So that will allow our Flipbook node to know how many rows and columns there are so that it can calculate the correct UVs. Okay, this tile input that we have here has to do with which of the frames of our animation is currently being displayed. So if we want to animate this, we can pass in time to our tile value to switch between the frames of our animation. And we actually want to set up 2 different ways of controlling the animation. First, we want to be able to play back all of the frames over the lifetime of the particle so that the first frame of the animation plays when the particle is first born, and the last frame of the animation plays at the end of its life. And this works really well for an animated Flipbook texture that doesn't loop, like an explosion or something. And the other option that we want to give our users is the ability to just control the playback speed of the frames directly. And this works well for a looping animation like our water splash texture. So the particle lifetime and the animation playback speed don't need to match. And so in order to set up those options, we need to add a branch node here. And so we're going to connect our branch node to our tile input parameter. And we're going to set up, we need to control our branch based on another parameter that we create. And this one's going to be a Boolean, so true or false. And we're going to call this one match particle phase so that the lifetime of our particles is what controls the playback speed of the animation frames. So if match particle phase is true, then we need to grab the lifetime of our particles and we need to bring it down here, and we're going to connect it with a multiply. And what we need now is the frame count. And the way that we get that is we're going to multiply the number of rows and columns and subtract 1. And this is going to give us the number of frames in our Flipbook animation. So the number of rows times the number of columns minus 1. And this will give us the number of frames that we have. And we're going to multiply that by the lifetime of our particle. And then we're going to plug that into the true connection here so that over the lifetime of the particle, it'll play back the number of frames that are in the animation. All right, well, what about for our false branch? For this one, we need to add another parameter, and we're going to call this one Flipbook speed. And we'll bring it in, and we're going to multiply speed by time. So here's our time node, and we'll connect it up to our multiply. So we're multiplying time by our Flipbook speed. Great, so this is going to allow us to control the playback rate of our particles. And then we need to multiply it by the number of frames that we calculated down here. So we're just going to add another multiply. And then we'll connect that up to false. Now the other thing that we need to do is for our playback here, because the particles aren't synced with the lifetime or because the animation playback is not synced with the lifetime of the particle, we need to make sure that each particle is playing at a different point in the animation. And so what we're going to do next is take our time value that we've calculated here, and we're going to add a fraction node. And this is going to turn our time into a loop. So it'll loop constantly between 0 and 1. And then to that value, we're going to add our random values that we're calculating. Can you see how each of our particles here in our preview has a different color. Well, these are the random values that we're calculating here in our shader with our hash33 function. And we've passed that over here to our multiply times 2 and subtract 1. And we're going to grab this value here and split it out and just use the green channel. And we're going to add this random amount to each of our particles so that each particle in the sequence is at a different phase in our animation. Okay, and then we're going to take this random value that we've added here and connect that up to our multiply, where we're multiplying by the number of frames. Okay, so like I said, we've got two different ways of controlling our particle playback rate. We have the method that uses the lifetime of the particle and plays all of the frames in the sequence over the particle's lifetime. And then we have the method that just uses a constant speed here so that we can control a looping animation and just control how fast that animation loops. Then we pass both of those into the branch node. Those go into our Flipbook node, and then we pass them out from our vertex stage to our fragment stage through our particle data custom interpolator. All right, so that is that's the vertex portion of the shader. Let's go ahead and do the pixel shader portion. So for this, we need to add a sample texture 2D node. And let's set up a default texture here. We're going to use this water churn 8x4 that we took a look at a minute ago. That's going to be our default. And we're just going to go ahead and plug this right into base color. And we're also going to plug the alpha into the alpha channel. And up until now, we've been using this emission pin, but I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect it. So now you can see we've got our texture applied to our particles, but we've got some kind of, or we're not actually flipping through the frames. So let's set that up next. But first, what I want to do really quickly is just set our rotation here to 0 so that we're not rotating, just so that we can get a clearer idea of how our animation is working. Okay, so we need to bring in the texture coordinates that we created with our Flipbook node. So we're just going to add our custom interpolator node here, our particle data. And up here, we've passed our U and our V coordinates into the red and green channels. So down here, we need to split that out. And we're going to combine our red and green channels here. And then pass that in as our texture coordinates for our texture sample. And you can see obviously that our texture sample here is not animating. And I believe the reason for that is because we didn't set defaults here on our Flipbook speed. So right now our speed is at 0, but if we set this to 1, there we go. Now you can see we've got our animating texture going. I'm just going to go ahead and set our preview here to 2D so that we don't have a sphere. And now you can see we've got our animated texture. There are a couple of issues with this though. Right now, we don't have transparency, and so our alpha value is not doing anything. So let's go ahead under our graph settings. We're going to open up our surface options and set our surface type to transparent. So now our alpha channel is working. And we're also going to come down here to alpha clipping and turn alpha clipping on. And you can see with alpha clipping that a lot of our particle is getting clipped away. And that's because our alpha clip threshold is set to 0.5. So anything in our texture that is darker than 0.5 is getting thrown away. We don't want that. We want this actually significantly lower. So we're going to set it to 0.4. And now there's a lot more of that transparent area that's getting left. But what you can see is that this animated texture that we're using here, if we take a look back in Photoshop again, it's basically playing back all of our frames and making it, or giving it the illusion that we've got this splash going on when actually it's just these individual frames. And I can control our our splash speed here if I set this to like 0.2, for example. So now the frames are playing back slower. You can make it go even slower. Set it to 0.1. So far, for the last 9 episodes up until today, we've just had these crazy kind of rainbow squares that we were representing as our particles. But now that we've set up this flipbook effect, we're calculating the coordinates for our flipbook here, and then using those coordinates to sample our texture here. Now we're actually seeing the ability to map textures that are animated and allow our particles to look way more realistic instead of just kind of rainbow squares. Now we've got these beautiful animated textures that we can apply. All right, so that's what we're going to do today. Let's go ahead and do some cleanup here. I'm going to select this portion of our shader and just group it. And we'll call this Flipbook. Let's move it down so it's a little bit more organized. Cool, so let's switch back to our scene and take a look at how we can use the new parameters that we've added today to improve the appearance of the sample particle effects that we've been creating. You know what, before we do that, just really quickly, there is one parameter that I forgot to add, and that is our texture 2D parameter. And we're just going to call this one Flipbook texture. And we'll drag it in, and we'll set it as our default. We're going to use our water churn texture, and we'll drag it in and connect it up. And this will allow us to set different textures on each of the different material instances that we're going to create. All right, here we are back in our scene, and we've got the sample particle systems that we've been working on. And you can see that after adding the animated textures, things are looking significantly better. Like I said, those rainbow squares are gone, and they're replaced with some really beautiful animated textures. Here's our waterfall, and you can see that I've used our water churn flipbook texture, and I've set the dimensions to 8x4 and the playback speed to 1. And if I hit this match particle phase, now you can see that our animation is slowed down a lot, so it's switching between our textures a lot slower. But if I set match particle phase off, now there's a lot more churn. I can even speed that up. If I set our flipbook speed to something like 5, now our churn's going a lot faster. Of course, these particles are moving fairly quickly, so it's hard to see this exactly here. But we can take a look at it in another example. Let's take a look at our smoke. So here is our chimney smoke effect. This one really looked nice when we added the wind to it. But here you can see that we've got our animated smoke particles, and that animation is just kind of creating this billowy movement on each of them, which is looking really nice. We've got our dimensions set to 8x8. We've got our playback speed set to 0.5 so that our smoke just kind of billows slowly. And we've got our match particle phase set to off. Let's see what happens if we turn this on here. You know, that's not so bad. I think I might actually enjoy leaving match particle phase true for our smoke particle system. That looks pretty nice. All right, our fountain is pretty similar to our waterfall. We're still using our water churn animated effect. We've got it set to 8x4. Match flipbook speed to 1, and match particle phase is off. So there's our fountain, looking pretty cool. And then last we have our mist particle effect. This one is going to benefit significantly from the feature that we add next week. Next week we're going to be adding opacity, And right now our mist is just kind of not opaque except right around the edges, and so it looks like this really thick pea soup fog. And the particles are kind of popping in and out. So that's something that we're going to fix in next week's video. But for now, what we can do is take a look at our texture. We're just using a single frame. So this is a texture that's not animated. And so you can see in order to do that, we've just set our flipbook dimensions to 1 by 1. And that way we can just use a single frame instead of an animated flipbook texture. And then since it's a 1 by 1, really the playback speed doesn't matter at all, or the match particle phase. But you can see that adding these animated textures to our particles has really made a difference in the overall quality of our particle system. We're moving along really nicely. All right, so next week, like I said, we're going to be adding opacity controls to our particles, and we're going to be getting rid of these kind of popping artifacts that you can see here as the particles spawn in and as they die. So that's going to be a cool one. Be sure to come back for that. In the meantime, let's jump over to Unreal, and I'll show you how to add flipbook animated textures to our particle system in that engine as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and you can see that we've got our rainbow square particles again, and we're going to need to add animated flipbook textures to these to make them look and behave much more like the physical effects that we're trying to create. So we're going to be adding animated flipbook textures. So let's switch over to our shader. Here is the particle system shader that we've created so far. And like I said a minute ago, I'm going to link the playlist down in the description. So in case you haven't seen the previous videos where we created all of these individual modules for our particle system, you can go back and watch those and catch up. All right, so we're going to go ahead and add flipbook animation here. So I'm just going to go ahead and search for the flipbook node. And there's our flipbook node. We're also going to need to create a bunch of parameters to control our flipbook effects. So I'm going to add a scalar parameter, and we're going to call this one flipbook speed. And we'll copy it. And this one's going to control how fast the frames play back. And this one we're going to call flipbook columns. This is the number of columns in our flipbook texture. We're going to call this one flipbook rows. And we can go ahead and plug those in. Our flipbook node here has flipbook rows there. We'll plug that in, and it has flipbook columns there. So we'll plug that in. And we also need a Boolean parameter. And this one's going to be called match particle phase. All right, so let's talk about how this is going to work. We want to add our flipbook node here is going to animate our flipbook texture. And we want to add two different ways of controlling how that animation works. We want first to be able to control just the raw speed of how fast those frames are playing back. And that's what our flipbook speed parameter here is for. Let's go ahead and set that up. We'll add a time node, and we'll multiply speed by time. And then we'll add a fraction node, and that will loop our time so that it will continuously go from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. And that is going to be our first control for how fast these things play back. Let's go ahead and add a static switch here. And we're going to plug this into the false branch. So this particle match phase Boolean parameter is going to control this switch. And we're switching back and forth. So if we want the particles to animate at the same rate that their lifetime covers, like with frame 1 at the beginning of their lifetime and the last frame at the end of their lifetime, that's going to be the other method. This method just gives us kind of like a flat rate that the frames are playing back that has nothing to do actually with the lifetime of the particles at all. And so what we can do here is for the true branch here, we can grab our particle lifetime, which is up here. We calculated this previously. So we're just going to go ahead and plug that into the true branch. And then for false, we have our time multiplied by flipbook speed. So if match particle phase is true, which I think we want on by default, then it's going to use the lifetime of our particles to determine which frame it's on. And if it's false, then it's going to be using this looping time here to control the playback rate. All right, so then we can just plug our switch here into our animation phase, and that will generate the time required to create the proper UV coordinates for our flipbook texture. Okay, now there is quite a bit of math involved. Well, I won't say quite a bit, but not zero. A math involved in generating our flipbook UV coordinates. And we want that to happen in the vertex stage, not the pixel shader, in the vertex shader. And so we're going to add a vertex interpolator node. And what this is going to do is tell Unreal anything on the left side of this node that I connect, we want to do that in the vertex shader. And then anything on the right side, we want to do this bit in the pixel shader. And the pixel shader part that we're going to do is the texture sample. So I'll add a texture sample node here and connect this to our UVs. So we're calculating our UV coordinates in the vertex shader, and then we're interpolating them to the pixel shader and then using them to sample our texture. And the last thing that we need is a texture to sample. And so we need to add a texture object parameter. And we're going to call this one flipbook texture. And we just go ahead and plug it into the texture input port. And we want to define a default texture here. So I'm going to come over here and find our water churn 8x4 texture. That's going to be our default. Okay, the last thing that we need to do is connect the results of our texture sample to our root node over here. Up until now, for the color of our particles, we've just been using our random vector noise that we generated, but now we're going to be using the texture coming from our animated flipbook texture. So let's go ahead and plug that in. And you can see that it's not working correctly here, and that's because we haven't given proper defaults to our parameters that we set up here. So for our columns, we know that our flipbook texture has 8 columns. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a 8 here for our default. And then it has 4 rows. And now we have our textures showing up correctly. So if we zoom in here, you can see that we have our textures animating. And if we turn off match particle phase, probably going to get, they're not animating at all because our flipbook speed is also set to 0, but we'll default that to 1. And now you can see our animated texture is playing back at the correct rate. Okay, really cool, but our flipbook texture here is just these black cubes instead of cutting out. And so we need to turn on our transparency. And so what I'm going to do is just select our root node here, and we're going to set our blend mode instead of opaque. We're going to set this to translucent. And now you can see once we've done that, now we have this opacity that's exposed. And so we can take our alpha channel of our texture and plug that into our opacity. And now you can see that our particles are actually transparent. We can see through them. So wherever they're black in the alpha channel, we can have transparency on our particles. All right, pretty cool. Let's sum up here really quickly. We added our flipbook node, which generates the proper coordinates for our flipbook texture. And we're doing that in the vertex shader by using a vertex interpolator. And we've added two different ways of controlling the playback rate. We can either use like a constant speed value, or we can tell it to match the phase of our particles. And so that way, each of the frames of the animation plays back from start to end over the lifetime of the particle. This one works really well for things that don't loop, like explosions. And just setting a static speed works really well for a looping animation like this water splash, for example, that just continuously loops. All right, so we've got our flipbook effect set up. Let's go ahead and switch over to our scene and take a look at how we can use these parameters to make our particle effects look more realistic. Okay, here we are back in our scene, and you can see that our particle effects now have that default texture that we assigned in our flipbook textures. So we're putting our water churn texture on all of these. The water churn texture looks pretty good for our waterfall. Let's go ahead and set our parameters. You can see I've opened up the material instances for each of the materials up here on the top. So this is for our waterfall. We're going to set the flipbook texture to our water churn texture, our water columns to 8 and rows to 4. And now we can control the flipbook speed here. So if I set this to 0, for example, now our flipbook particles, or the textures on the particles, are not animating. You can't really tell though because the particles are moving so fast. Let's just go ahead and keep our flipbook speed at 1. All right, so here is our smoke. And you can see, obviously, this texture is not working out so great for this effect. So let's go ahead and change that. Here's our smoke texture that we're using. It's just called Cloud 04 8x8. All right, now we need to set the columns and rows correctly. This one has 8 columns and 8 rows. You can see we've set it to 4, and that's not working right. So we set this to 8. Now we're getting good results. Okay, I think in Unity we determined that match particle phase worked really well for this one. So I'm just going to set that to true. And now our chimney smoke is looking a lot more like chimney smoke and less like water churn, which is nice. Okay, here is our fountain. And the water churn is working really well for this one. So let's keep our churn texture, our rows and columns at 8 and 4, and our speed. Let's see, maybe we'll set our speed to something like 5, just to make our fountain a little bit more energetic looking. All right, and then here is our mist over here. And you can see that our splash is not working so great for that. So let's go ahead and pick a different texture. And we're just going to pick this cloud texture here that just has 1 frame. And you can see, obviously, that's not working very well because we've told it that it has 8 rows and columns. And the mist just has 1. So we're going to set 1 row and 1 column. And now we've got a lot better result. Okay, so we can see that we've got this nice floating mist here. Now, like I said a minute ago when we were doing the Unity version, we've come a long way here. We've added these animated effects, and they've improved quite a bit, but there's still a couple of issues to deal with. I think the most obvious one right now, especially on our mist, it's just way too opaque, and you can't see through the mist at all. And not only that, but the particles are popping. You can see, especially here on the chimney smoke, when the particles come to their end of their lifetime, they're just instantly popping out. And the same thing when they're born, the particles just instantly pop in. And this is what we're going to be addressing next week. So we're going to be adding opacity controls so that we can control the fade in and fade out and overall opacity of the particles. So be sure to tune into that next week. Hope you enjoyed our video today. This was a really effective one because we took our particles all the way from those rainbow colored squares to now something that looks significantly more like the effects that we're going for. All right, have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.